Maybe I'd like to open up, there's also recent discoveries of a lot of it's sort of buzzwords, but there's another thing they've coined, like the God spot of the brain. And a lot of the modern, as you say, MRI imaging and technologies are allowing us to pinpoint a bit of the brain which is activated when we have mystical or religious experiences, which these concepts actually segue into what I want to talk about in this great debate: are we free to alter our own minds? It seems like there's an ability that's happening in our culture at the moment when they touched upon this in the documentary, that we've had 40 plus years of the first wave of reconnection with these substances in modern Western culture. Do you think now that we are entering a phase where we are mature enough as a global culture to understand where these substances are coming from and how to use them properly?
Indeed, one of the things that we've discovered just quite recently is the incredible plasticity of the brain, that we can really make massive changes to our thinking, our way of being, if we're prepared to put the work into it. Personally speaking, I'm a very strong believer that each person on this planet needs to have a physical discipline, and a discipline that works on the unconscious. Most of the study that I've done has been very subjective, because I'm working in agronomy and I'm not allowed to sort of go out and do psychological research. So my own subjective study for the last kind of 35 years has been to investigate every discipline or practice that I could find around the world that focus on working on the unconscious, the subconscious. And as the last years have gone by, I've started to understand more and more that we are actually largely unconscious beings. And what we are doing with all of this stuff is we're trying to find a window into the unviewable. By definition, the unconscious is not conscious. We cannot experience it. But what we can experience is the effect of it. And we can work on aspects of ourselves that gear and enmesh with the unconscious. And so I believe that one of the ways that we can find our way out of this is to involve ourselves sometimes in a mindless discipline. For some people, their nucleus accumbens and the dopamine that's working in this addiction part of the brain produces OCD for them, and they spend 16 hours a day cleaning the house, compared to somebody that's out taking drugs. And exactly the same process is going on inside the brain. The brain is very, very... I view the brain a little bit like an orchestra. There's all sorts of areas of it. We can do it we can play a lot of music with this thing if we start to treat it as a tool that we can work on through unconscious disciplines.
Well, speaking of tools, and to bring it back to the plant sacraments, in indigenous cultures they have an understanding that these aren't drugs. They call it, the sacraments, which means they're sacred, they're used in a sacred way, but they're tools of consciousness, and it's what nature gave them, and it's tools to explore their own mind, their own divinity, and the connection to the planet. Would either of you like to sort of comment on some of the plant sacraments that are talked about at EGA and also are on the rise at the moment? For instance, there's ayahuasca coming out of South America. There's San Pedro, the cactus, which has been around everywhere, and you actually see in quite a lot of suburban backyards all throughout the Western world. But to get back to the tools of consciousness, what do you think of the main ones that are appearing now in Western culture, and how are they being used?
I think that's a very interesting question, because in fact, as well as sacraments, the traditional cultures were using them as medicines in many, many different dimensions. And I suspect that, just to go back to your previous question about are we mature enough, are we ready to start to embrace the kinds of consciousness expansion that I guess many, many cultures have been exploring for hundreds of thousands of years, is that in some ways, in spite of the fact that it's way too easy to generalise, I think we're probably not quite there, because most of these sacraments, medicines, whatever, were discovered and then used in an evolutionary sort of a process. And what we've tended to see in the last 20, 30, 40 years in Western culture is much more a revolutionary sort of approach to the use of any number of kinds of sort of mind expansion tools. And so I think in a way we really need to go back to maybe starting to sort of do some of the pre-preparation and then the preparation before we can use any of these.
I think that brings up an interesting point, Martin, that indigenous cultures have not only had a connection with the earth, they've also had a heritage where they've had elders, they've had a structure in place to communicate the essence of these ideas and how to use these tools with the plant sacraments and the whys and wherefores. As Tim was saying, as someone from the 60s, we've only really recently had an opportunity to have global elders. We've had the indigenous people, but in Western culture that's often been marginalised and in some cases exterminated, people who have these connections to the plants. Do you think that there's a duty of care perhaps in people from the previous generation of the 60s or 70s or whatever, even the 80s, to communicate their experiences to modern youth?
Oh, absolutely. That's exactly why I'm involved in EGA. Speaking as an oldie, I'm over 60, I'm horrified that so few of the people that were part of my generation, that I still know, that came out of essentially the same culture as me and essentially the same drug experiences as me, they didn't seem to get anything out of it. They're living in the suburbs now with mortgages, and I go around and see them. I had an extraordinary experience last year where I visited my childhood friend from school, and he's an accountant and he works in London and he's got a Mercedes and he lives in Wiltshire, south of London, and I went round and had a meal with him and his wife, and I hadn't seen him for 35 years, and we were thick as thieves at school before that. He was the attractive one. He was the one that always got the chick. I was always the one that got the really boring one or the fat one or whatever, you know. It was an extraordinary thing. And I went back and had dinner with them, and I talked a little bit about where I've been, and I've been all over Africa and Southeast Asia and Japan and so on. And after dinner, being English, she went into the kitchen to do a little washing up, and we went out into the lounge to go and smoke. And I went, wait a minute, this is really weird. No, I want to go in the kitchen and go and wash up. I want to sort of, no, he came out. So we went out into the lounge and sat, and we talked for a couple of minutes, and then he burst into tears. And I said, what the hell's going on? And he said, all the way through school, and I was the number one, and I've had this fucking boring life, and I'm an accountant, and you were the asshole, and look what you've done, you've been all over the fucking world. And I go, wow, yeah, I suppose it's a bit like that, really. At some point, you've got to kind of let go and trust that some inner unconscious part is drawing you towards an experience. So as Carlos Castaneda in Don Juan's book said, every moment in front of us there's a cubic centimetre of chance. It's only a cubic centimetre. It's not a great big thing that's going to welcome you in and it's got advertising. You've got to dive into that little hole. You can't put a bit into it. You've got to go, I don't know what it is, but something inside me is moving me to do it and just go for it.